Welcome. We are glad you're joining us tonight on our Tuesday night podcast. We are here again live, probably, 15, 20 seconds ahead of you. So you're hearing this a little late, but that is all the more reason for you to put your questions in, and we will see them within a very short amount of time, and we will get to them live as we can. So tonight we're talking about normal. What's normal anyway? I thought about this um, uh, because I was talking to my daughter. Actually, I was talking in the front of my car. So this happens actually pretty often. We're like driving down the street. My wife and I will be talking, and my daughter Adriana is for sure the nosiest of all my kids. She just hears things that sound. And it's funny because I would think maybe it would be like certain topics, but it's not certain topics. It seems to be only the things we don't actually want her to hear that she like peeks up and listens, right?
Yeah.
And so the other day I said something to Clarissa about I don't know, something having to do with the cars. It was just totally a side comment, but my daughter was like, "Why did you say that?" And I said, "It's not worth explaining." Because it literally wasn't worth explaining. It was just such a trivial thing. And I was just like, it just can't even be bothered to explain this right now. And she goes, "I think it's worth explaining." And I won't make everybody hate me with my response to that. But in that moment, I thought, I wonder how often God thinks about our statements and the way we see life that way. We look at God, this is important. And God's like, no, it's not. It's really not important. And so the idea of what we see as normal as opposed to what God sees as normal came into my mind. And that's where this all kind of came from. And I was having another conversation with my wife, and we were talking about the championing of washing hands and where that kind of came from. And Clarissa made the statement that, maybe we were talking about this actually came from a conversation about people in the gym and how some of the older people in the gym don't seem to have hygiene standards and, don't really wipe down the machines and stuff like that, which, if I'm honest, is kind of a new way of doing things in the gym. But when you leave a seat really super sweaty, it's been common etiquette to wipe it down. This stuff's been there since before COVID. It's not like a new thing since COVID. But she said, I wonder if it's just like that for them growing up, it wasn't like a big deal. And I was like, I mean, come on, we've been washing hands for years. And she was like, no, it's like pretty recent. And I was like, no way. And she goes, look it up. And so I looked it up. And sure enough, the original push for this was in the 1800s.
Yeah.
I think it was in the 1840s, actually. And then a few years later, Florence Nightingale was like a second champion of it. But this never caught traction until the 1970s.
Yeah.
Can you believe that?
Yeah.
That's over 100 years. That's a long, 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 long time for washing hands not to be a thing.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about that is how normal washing hands is for some people and how for others it's just not, right? And so again, back to this issue of like, first you got on the one hand, you have this idea of what we see as normal and what actually is normal. And then we have this, what should be normal and what starts to become normal. And so in those two kind of mindsets, I started thinking about the idea of how God sees things, how we see things, and how we can learn to see things God's way. And so the time frame and all that's irrelevant, but through salvation, at least this is where I'm hoping to go with this, that we can learn to see things the way God sees them, which according to scriptures is how things are supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just go that direction. And first, let me ask the question this way. If you could define the difference between normal to man as things have become and normal to God, how things are and have always been, how would you define that? The difference between the two?
Yeah. Well, the difficulty, I think, is that there is no such thing as that which is normal to man.
Curveball. I love these conversations.
Yeah, that because there's, it's funny how we see things, and we use these phrases like common sense and normal, but what we use them for the most part to describe how we feel, not what is normal or what is common sense, just what we think.
Yeah.
you know and we use words like normal and common sense so that we can impose what we think on other people. And that's the idea. It's a passive aggressive way of making the world like us, is really what it comes down to. Is, well, it's just normal. What I'm doing, this is just normal. This is what everybody does. And it's not true. It's not what everybody does, and it's not normal. It's what we do. And there may be other people who do it, but we don't have a definition for normal, when it comes to most of life. I mean, where are we going to get it from? So that's why I was kind of leading towards, is the only common ground for what we would call normal really is other than the law, but that doesn't deal with, the general ways of life. But Christianity, the Bible, is the only way that we can really have a reference for what is normal, because what is normal is what God thinks is normal, and everything else is not normal. Any deviation from that is not normal, because you have things like, uh, cultural norms,
Right.
And then you have family norms. I mean, like, it's funny because there are people that I know that, when they see how my family is, they think your family's weird. And I think, you say that because we're not like your family.
Mm-hmm.
You're not saying that because you have some, you've traveled the world, and you've observed humanity, in a big way, and have been able to determine, what for the most part is normal with most people in the world. No, it's just you're just comparing one family to another family. And that's the problem, is that, so to have an idea, to start with, from this frame of reference, of what is normal to man, there isn't, there really isn't. I mean, there might be some commonalities, and there might be things that I could mention in terms of observations. There are typical things, that could be thrown into that, but still calling these things normal, still kind of stretching it a bit.
So it's interesting you're mentioning the issue of like culture and those norms, but it's like the scripture I actually was kind of mulling over for this was when so in John chapter 8, I won't read the whole thing, but basically Jesus having a conversation with the religious, we call them religious leaders, right, of that time, and they're talking about this, they're saying, you have a demon, I don't have a demon, and he says, he goes into this idea that I honor my Father, right? Mm-hmm. So they're looking at, you have a demon, and he's saying, I honor my Father. I don't have a demon. And he says, I don't seek my own glory. There is one who seeks, one who judges. And then he says, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death. So this stuff's all really foreign to them. Everything he's saying is really weird, right?
Yes.
And so which is why they're saying he has a demon. But then he says this word, if I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It is my Father who honors me. And then towards the end, he goes, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. And then they say to him, you're not 50 years old yet, and you've seen Abraham. And then he says, in my opinion, this is my favorite quote in the entire Bible, and has been for a really long time, because honestly, I can't think of anybody else who said anything more bad than this. This is like the baddest statement, period. He says, most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah.
And so this statement of like, you, temporary, time, and was, I am, always have been, past, present, future, will always be.
Yeah.
And so the statement is so factual, but again, they're looking at him saying, you're weird, and he's saying, I've always been.
Yeah.
And so norm.
Right.
And their culture is stemming from Abraham says quite a bit. I mean,
Yeah.
the first of the four patriarchs. So it's a really deep thing for Jesus to say about Abraham to them. But this idea that Jesus is looking at things, he's doing things, he's saying things, and he's saying, my word is I am, right? This is the same thing. Who I am and what I do is the normal.
Mm-hmm.
And what you guys are doing, you don't even understand.
Yeah.
And so this idea that like there can be such a gap between how God sees things and who God is and who we are and how we see things is kind of the gap I'm hoping to close.
Yeah.
And so how do you get to normal?
Yeah. Well, that phrase before Abraham was I am, there's a number of times where Jesus says things like this, and I call them Jesus Terminator phrases. Because they're moments where he is just showing them, this is the way it is, I'll be back. It's that kind of a thing of where, he's just making an emphatic statement about himself and who he is. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And those are Terminator statements. I mean, he just simply says, "This is it."
Yes.
And so, so what I have, it's funny because being a pastor. So I've gone through some phases being a pastor. So first of all, being a pastor was I wanted to be a pastor because I knew that's what God called me to be, and I wanted to please God, and so I that was my motivation. My motivation was just simply to please God and to win people to Jesus, and so it was about God and His will for my life. And then I became a pastor, and almost right away, and I'm only saying what other pastors won't say, it became nothing but frustration, because you realize just how little humanity is in terms of thinking. It's very, very small-minded, and only thinks in their own little box, in their own little head. But they think that they're actually, exploring the universe. But they're not. They're only exploring, 4 or 5 inches inside their own head. But it's just, it's astounding to me. And so there was that reality that most people don't really, we mentioned it before, when I was in school, they used to say that the average human only used 5% of his brain. And then that's been kind of debunked over the years, but I still think it's true, just from my observations. I'm pretty confident that most people only use about 5% of their brain and don't really think about life, don't think beyond their own selves. Their selves, that's their universe, and that's all they really care about. And Christian or non-Christian, it really doesn't matter. And I'm just simply talking about the majority of people. I'm not talking about like everybody. I've met people who are not like that, but for the most part, it's just their whole lives are really just about them. And so getting to normal is going to be very, very difficult because normal is something that's beyond you. And so, but it's very difficult to get there. So, my sort of transitioning, through, the desire to want to preach, to actually becoming a pastor, and then realizing, there's only one hope that I have as a pastor, to convince people of how small-minded they are and how little they know about what they think they know. And that is that I myself have to be the example, of what it's like to not be like that. And so that now my whole life is about exploring the universe. It's like staying outside of my own head and trying to live inside of others, trying to go beyond. And living in England and gave me an opportunity to learn another culture. The old saying of England and America are 2 countries separated by a common language, and there really is a truth of that. Is that you can say things in England that are the same words that we use here, but it's different. And it's just hard to explain the difference, in some way that would make sense. But cultures are different. and people are different, and lots of things are different, and they're not wrong because they're different. There are many things in life that are all right. They're all okay. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. That's something I've talked about a lot, is this binary thinking. Many people, they just can't get out of a binary way of thinking. Is there's this way and then there's that way. There's right and there's wrong and there's no in between. So this can't be right and this right at the same time, because only one thing can be right. And just that kind of thinking is really makes it difficult to approach what is normal. But the only way you're going to be able to bridge the gap of normal is to realize that you aren't normal. You are you. And your life experiences and how you've functioned in life aren't. You've never had the opportunity to be normal. You've been raised by two people at the most, usually. Maybe some older siblings have helped, but you've had the input for the most part of your life from a handful of people. You've had a few teachers. You've probably met 20 people in your whole life that have actually had the most influence of your life in your life. How in the world can you think that you've learned normal from only talking to 20 people? It's just not possible. And so you have to go outside of yourself. That's why I read a lot. Which was another step in the evolution of my reality as a pastor. It was that I realized if I don't start reading, I'm not gonna know how to get through this. And I was going through, I just unpacked a bunch of my old books, and just looking at the titles of these books, I mean, they're literally all over the place. I mean, just books of all different kinds of things. And I thought, man, I've really had a great opportunity to learn about a lot of stuff in the world, not technical books, beyond technical books, books by different preachers at different eras, different countries, so they're dealing with things from different perspective, different books by not preachers, just people that were just well-known authors, and just reading and getting into the mind of as many people as I possibly can. And that's how you begin to develop an idea of here's the common threads, of things, and so like what you're saying about washing hands is, I was driving down the street and coming here tonight, and there was a woman. She was driving, and I could be completely wrong about this, but it looked like she just had a cloth that she tied around her face, and I looked at that and I thought, because it's obviously temporary, and I thought, she got in her car and went, oh my God, I don't have my mask. What am I going to do? And then reached for the first thing that she could find and tied it to her face. Now she can breathe easy because she's not going to die, because now she has a towel over her face. Because when I first looked at her, I thought, is she, Islamic or Middle Eastern or something? And I pulled up and no, it's definitely not that, because it was this like pink thing. It wasn't I could just see it from my window, from behind, and I could see, and it looked kind of white. And as I got closer to her, it was just like a pink, looked like a baby's washcloth or something, and so in her mind, what's normal, that's normal, that is normal for her. And I look at that, I think, you're nuts, and the reason why it's normal for her is because it just is in her head, because medically that's just whacked. That's grabbing the nearest thing to you that's probably already got germs on it and
Yeah.
sticking it on your face that's not going to help you. It's not going to even slow them down, because it's just hanging over her face. It wasn't like, it wasn't covered. She just had this thing just hanging. So if there wasn't, and there was nobody else in her car. So if her windshield broke and somebody splattered like acid or something through the windshield or something, she'd probably be okay. But beyond that, it's not going to help for very much, and so it's like, but to her, because of her lack of understanding of how germs work, that's normal. And so that's the problem with normal within ourselves, is because we're lacking information. When we're lacking information, then we do things that are not normal because we think they're normal based on the few bits of information that we have, or at least that they should be normal. So you should be, grabbing the nearest thing and putting it on your face, while you're driving because it's safe, and it's, that's not normal, but that's normal for her. And so that's what I mean is the idea of normal. You really have to, yeah, you're going to have a hard time getting closer to God in terms of normal until you realize that you as a person, as an individual, you're not normal. You're just you, and you may do things that you've seen other people doing. And you may do things because you've read about, a couple of things here and there, but that doesn't make it normal. And so there's it's a lot more difficult.
Okay, we have a question that's actually referring back to when you mentioned the law specifically. The question is, but there's a legal standard in law of being reasonable, as defined as rational, appropriate, ordinary, or usual in the circumstances. Wouldn't that be considered normal for man?
Okay. That doesn't make any sense at all, that statement. There is no law based on rationale. There's no law code as to what is rational and what is not rational. I don't understand the question really.
A legal standard in law.
There's no legal standard in law as something is rational or not.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know.
Maybe you can clarify the question.
Yeah, because that's just that sounds that almost exemplifies exactly what I'm talking about, is the idea of just, we just make stuff up. When we don't know things, we just make stuff up based on a few bits and pieces of information that we understand. But there's nothing, there's no legal definition of rational. I mean, if there was, then we wouldn't, how in the world would we be able to have, why would we have court cases at all? We say, that's not rational, you're guilty. End of story. Because we already know what rational is. It's already well defined. So it's not, yeah, I don't know. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, maybe there's maybe you can clarify the question. How do you account for well, actually, let me ask it this way. You mentioned you are just you. When you realize you are just you, you're not. Well, I guess the question really is, so does normal only exist outside of me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the reality. If you are normal, then you are like what's going on outside of you, not what's going on inside of you. And that's the big problem, is that our standard for normal is internal, which is not where you can't create your own standard for normal unless you're God. But you can't just say, well, I deem this to be normal. I mean, there might have been, during, monarchy, it could be, the king could declare that today is, white suit Wednesday, and everybody has to wear a white suit, and then that will be normal. You can decree things like that, and then you can make them normal. But we don't have that option. We can determine as parents, we can determine what's normal in our house. That doesn't mean it's normal. It just means it's normal in our house. And so, like I said, it always has to be external. Always has to be outside of us.
So how do you accommodate for, or how do you account for, because when you're talking about going in the direction of understanding God's word, right? Which is defining normal in all reality. It's what tells us what's normal, right? That a true statement?
That the Word of God tells us what's normal.
Yeah.
What's acceptable. Yeah,
Acceptable.
what's acceptable. I
What's the
mean,
difference?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, normal's I don't think of it's
Try to
hard
make the word like
it's hard to think of normal in that context because God isn't trying to define normalcy as much as he's defining acceptability. So because you don't it's a bit difficult because it is a bit of a wordplay. It's a bit of semantics. But normal is more like a general idea, where acceptable is more specific. When you're talking about something being normal, you're usually talking about something in a more general sense. You know, having a clock is normal, in your house. That's normal. Okay, let's just use that as an example. You could debate it, but let's just say you do. But that doesn't tell us what kind of clock you have. It doesn't say whether normal is a digital clock or normal is an analog clock. And I don't know the answer to that. I would say, from, my experience, of course, which is limited, is that I've yet to go to somebody's house that doesn't have a clock of some sort in their house, whether it's on their microwave or on their stove or, sitting on the mantle or something like that. For the most part, there is some kind of timekeeping device. But there's no way I could say this one had, I think the majority of people had digital clocks or something like that. Couldn't say those kinds of things. I couldn't make that kind of a statement. And so I think acceptable and normal are similar to that. Is, acceptable, you're talking about, when you say what's acceptable, you have to say something specific. What's acceptable, and then, well, try it with your kids. What's acceptable, and then they're going to say, okay, well, can I do this? We used to joke about it. Our kids were growing up. Is like, don't touch that, and then they would, can I touch it with my elbow? I'm not touching with my finger. Is it okay to touch it with my elbow? Or can I touch it with my shoulder? It's like, don't touch that. That's not enough. You have to say a little bit more. So what's acceptable is you have to say, don't touch that with anything. You see what I'm saying? So that's the difference between, acceptable and normal. And so the Bible is more specific. The Bible gives us a more specific understanding of how life should be lived. And so it's more than establishing what is normal, because even within that, normal can be cultural, can be different culturally. Like praise and worship, for example. It's normal for churches to have praise and worship, but what does that praise and worship look like? So now you're talking about acceptable, and now you're talking about something that's a little bit different.
I guess I'm trying to think of a way to explain this so it, like, at least the direction I'm thinking with the idea of normal. Because, for instance, it's normal from God's perspective to give and take life. But from man's perspective, it's like, it can be unacceptable from man's perspective, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It's not normal for God to give and take life. It's normal for God to give life. It isn't normal for God to take life.
Why not? He's the one that determines when you die.
No, you're acceptable. Again, see that's the difference between those things. If God does that, it's acceptable. But he's not like regularly going around going, you.
Okay, that's zooming too far in though. Like I'm talking
well, no,
about,
I mean, normal is
like,
yeah.
If God's okay, all right. That's a semantics game though. So you go,
not really.
If God gives life, it starts, right?
Yeah, God giving life
ends,
is normal because he does that to everybody.
Okay, I'm not talking about God killing people. I'm talking about your life ends. God's the one that determined that happens.
Well, that's a result of sin, so that's a whole nother story. But we're getting into a different kind of dimension here. God didn't create us to die. See, there are things that are normal that are not necessarily things that God sees as normal.
That's actually what I'm after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, death isn't normal to God.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good example. Death is not
Yeah,
normal to
Okay.
God. It is normal to us.
So that's
But
this
it
is
is
this
not
is
normal
this
to
is what
God.
I'm talking. This is kind
Yeah.
of the so I didn't have the specifics to like
Right.
the circumstances.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm after is
Yeah.
that God has it the way it should have been.
Yes.
The way it always should have been.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And the way we have it now. And that's why I
Yes.
asked you that first question about what's the difference between how things have become
Yeah.
and how things should have been
Yeah.
in the beginning. I
Well,
guess.
yeah,
Maybe
I
that
mean,
was a better way to
death's a
ask
good
the question.
example. Yeah, because death is normal to us, but nobody looks forward to death.
Mhm.
You know, it's not like, oh, you know, I mean, I do know, like my grandfather, you know, he was 93 when he passed away, and I saw him. I think he was either 91 or 92, and he told me, he said, I hope I'm not here that much longer. He said, because I'm such a burden. But it wasn't that he wanted to die; it's that he just didn't want to be a burden.
Yeah.
And on people because he was feeble and infirm. He could still get around, but he had to use a walker. They had to cook for him. He wasn't able to cook for himself and stuff like that. And so he had to be taken care of. And he was like, I don't want to be here anymore. But it wasn't a thing of where he's looking forward to dying,
Mhm.
you know. But you know, so death isn't something that we look forward to, but death is normal. You know, it's like, you know, death and taxes, you know, the things that are normal in life. But yeah, so, but to God, you know, there was never, you know, death was never meant to be the case. And so again, but that's why you have to understand the Bible, you know, like I said, because that's how you know, well, where did death come from? Death came from sin, you know, and so you can see it. You can see the progression of death in the Bible. And so that's how you're going to learn about what is or isn't normal is by watching it play out, you know, in the Bible.
So yeah, a similar thing, I guess, with sin then, because it is normal for man to sin.
Yeah, but it's not normal to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that whole idea, yeah, because there's no sin in heaven.
Uh-huh.
You know, that's why Satan and his angels were kicked out of heaven, is because that doesn't happen in heaven. There's no sin in heaven. You know, and usually that concept in and of itself is to me, you know, one of the things why do some people want to go to heaven when it's quite clear that they want to sin? You know, because heaven won't be what they think it's going to be for them. Because, you know, it's not like God, you know, turns on a happy switch, you know, when we die and we get to heaven and then we're just happy. You know, we are what we were before. So, but anyway, that's digressing. The idea of you know the idea of you know normal, you know, like I said before, is it's only something that can be seen through the Word of God. It has to be seen through God's Word, not you know not just by our personal experience or you know what we see or think is normal.
Okay, we've got clarity on this question, so I'm going to have to jump over one question and then come back to it. But that is the definition of reasonable in Black's Law Dictionary and others as it pertains to the Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment talking about
that's a definition of reasonable. Okay, go back to the original question.
Okay, I'll read it again.
Yes.
But there's a legal standard in law of being reasonable as defined as rational, appropriate, ordinary, or usual in the circumstances. Wouldn't that be considered normal for man?
Okay, but rational, normal, etc., those are not definable either. Again, this is why I mentioned this.
Or would they be circumstantial?
What?
Those statements. It would depend on the circumstance, right?
Well, but again, they're not. You can't. There's no definition, you know, to something so broad. You know that's a you know it is a definition of the word reasonable. Okay, but that doesn't clarify anything. It just gives a definition for the word reasonable. And so you can't. It's like kind of like in our Bible study we had on Friday night. You know, you can't just take a word and you decide how that applies to what and how it works. So when you take a general statement about some particular thing, you can't define the boundaries of that. What is rational? Okay. Yeah, okay, reasonable is rational. What is rational? Well, we don't have you're going to give me another general definition to define rational. And so we're never going to be defining anything specifically by that point. And then normal, again, what is normal? Well, whatever is normal is whatever is reasonable. Okay. Well, what defines normal or reasonable? It's going to depend on the scenario. It's going to depend on the environment. So there's no standard, and that's the point that I was making with all that, is that there's no standard for this. It's just what we think. And so like, and that's why we have jurors. Is the jurors they're the ones who decide that in this circumstance, are these things, because that's probably, that I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure that probably has to do with the idea of reasonable doubt. A person can only be found guilty if there's reasonable doubt.
It has to do with search and seizure, actually, of property. That's what
there's
actual Fourth Amendment. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. Okay. So that's. But again, so you have reasonable doubt. You have reasonable in terms of search and seizure. So again, you're talking about things that are not defined. They're not clarified. And so to try to make a point that, now that gives us a scope to work with. We aren't any better off than we were before. And that's my point, is we aren't any better off than we were before. We still don't have a definition of how we are to behave, when it comes to those statements. Okay, you're to act normal, you're to act reasonable, I was going to mention this earlier because there is some, God didn't leave us to ourselves to figure all this out.
Right. It actually does. I'm sorry. I'm listening and doing this at the same time, just to say it does actually cover reasonable suspicion as well.
Okay. Yeah. So the idea of again, coming back to this idea of normal, we're just never going to get to this place of normal as being some defined thing. It's something that is going to be there. There's going to be, it's going to depend on who's talking about it. And so we're never gonna be able to define normalcy in the true sense. But that's what I mean when I say if we want to try to get to what God thinks is normal, okay, and in a good way, of course. And so I'm kind of, to keep from going off onto acceptable, but what God thinks is normal in a good way, how we should behave, generally speaking. There's, that's where I was going. God has kind of put in us some things that we pick up cues, when we're in environments, and so we know how to behave in a certain way. Like if you're in a really nice restaurant, you behave very differently than you do like at Jack in the Box. So you take all your kids into Jack in the Box and, you sit down at a table, they're screaming, yelling, and carrying on. That's normal because that's what most kids are doing in McDonald's.
Right.
Okay. But you go to some really high class restaurant, that's not happening, And so
there's not even kids at restaurants.
When you walk into an environment, you begin to scan. That's how we're made. God created us this way. You begin to scan. And then you try to find a level, what's normal in this environment, and whether the environment is normal at all. Mm-hmm. You might feel like, oh, this is just plain weird. I don't even want to be here. And out you go. Okay, fine. Chances are that's probably not normal. That environment is not normal because you don't want to be there at all. Unless you're the kind of person that's abnormal. Then if you're abnormal, then you don't like being in normal environments. And so, but for the most part, let's just all things equal, everybody's sound. And so things change, so you just can't define and say, this is where things are, but normal, our perceptions of normal are not going to get us any closer to God. And that's where I think the problem lies, is that what we think is normal, or what we perceive as normal, you know, I mean, just talk about hell. I don't think anybody perceives hell as normal. The more you think about it, the more not normal that it is, you know, but it's normal to God, and people are going to go there. And people are going to go there because they have chosen to not believe and think, I can't believe that a loving God would send anybody to hell. And which is the irony of it all, is we're saying, you know what, there can't be a hell because that's not normal. And that's really what we're saying. And that's where we have the problem, trying to know God and to have a relationship with God, is because we do have things that we think are normal that God doesn't. And so if we're going to get there, we're going to have to kind of get rid of that idea. And that's what I was talking about, when I was talking about when I started pastoring, and kind of the development of pastoring over the years, is I've realized, if I'm going to help people to get out of their small world and into the bigger world of God, then it's going to have to start with me being the example of living that way, living outside of that small world, and trying to, deal with the issues that are, that keep, like Paul says, he says, I become all things to all men, that by all means I might save some. And so that's been kind of, so that to me has been the way to find normal, is by becoming all things to all men, and then you start to find some normal. But again, you always have to keep that idea that normal is not a static thing. There's no such thing as a static idea of normal. Normal in one situation is not normal in another situation. It's normal for me to take my clothes off and go into the shower. It's not normal for me to take my clothes off and go into a public pool. But I'm doing the same thing, but it's not normal. And so you have to understand that normal does have situation associated with it.
Interesting question here. Because I was thinking about this question in light of where we are as a nation and where we've been, frankly, for the last several years now. But would it be sensible to think that anything goes is the new norm, considering the direction of humanity society today?
I think that's a bit cynical. Yeah, I think that's being a bit cynical, that anything goes, because not anything goes.
Yeah.
And a lot of what's going on in our world right now is, chaos. And it's not contrived chaos. It's not like somebody sat down and said, hey, how do we blow up the world? It's just the way things have happened.
You think that those things have happened predominantly? Well, what do you think has been the predominant cause of that? Some of it has been very external, things happening.
So yeah, I mean, so it would depend on which particular thing you're talking about. But like, obviously, COVID there was no contrivance. It wasn't, in spite of the conspiracy theories.
I was just gonna say, no, man, Fauci did the whole thing. It was all his idea.
But they're gonna get us banned now from YouTube.
I gotta be careful what I say on here.
Yeah,
man.
yeah, you can't even joke about stuff anymore. But the idea of our world in general, when you generalize our world and the way it is right now, it's hard to do that without being cynical. You have to break it up into pieces, because it's not all, anything goes. It's still pretty sure that there's still people getting married, still raising families. Like my neighbors are, they're married and they're young and they have 3 kids. So it's not quite anything goes.
What's young to you?
Young people, younger than me. What's normal?
Yeah.
Just normal young people. Yeah, no, I think they're in their 30s. And to have 3 kids in their 30s is unusual. That's not normal. Um, but anything, no, I wouldn't, because like I said, it's cynical. Because I think, and it's funny because if you think about it, we're going to really go off on a tangent here talking about this, but if you think about it, I'm my name, here's a good example of what I'm talking about. Because to me, I'm looking at, young people these days just don't want to work, a bunch of losers, blah blah blah, classic line of old people who've worked, have been industrious and have accomplished something with life, say about young people who don't work, or aren't working. Yeah, you're just lazy. You need to be like me. But my neighbor, who's in his 30s, late 30s probably, said, no, I think people are just fed up with being, he didn't use the term, I use it a lot now, but office slaves. He said they're just done. They've realized there's more to life than working. And when he said that, I was like, you know what? If that's not true, it should be.
Mhm.
It should be, because, like I've said many, many times, I am really, really disappointed in where our country has gone in terms of work, employment. It's to me, and the Bay Area is just the epicenter of it. But it's happening everywhere, and it's happening more and more everywhere. Is that, your life is your job, like it or not. And it's funny because I was reading an article about Google, and Google's decided, oh yeah, we can't be having all these perks, for all these people, and so they're going to stop giving people food. They're just going to stop feeding people like they have been, and all these little, on-site things that they've had. They're going to stop doing that. And I thought, I've been around long enough to know that the reason why they did that was so they could get the cream of the crop,
Mhm.
Employees. That was the reason why they started doing that kind of stuff, is that they would attract the cream of the crop, the people who really had it together. And so now Google's big and wonderful, and now they can just kick everybody to the curb by saying, oh, hey, we need to save money. And it's, no, you don't need to save money. You just got what you wanted, and that's
Mhm.
all.
Mhm.
You know, it's like
Maybe Google's
a bunch of prostitutes.
Google got caught up in the bank thing. They're
Well, it's
they're
all,
they're hurting.
the whole, no, no, I mean, the whole thing to me is just horrible. It's just I mean, I'm, like I said, we're going on a tangent now,
That's all right.
but,
We got a whole
the idea,
second segment.
the idea of, having to work your butt off. I don't have a problem with working an 8-hour day. I don't have a problem with that. But when it's like, I mean, you just get tired of it. You just get tired of it. It's like everything comes out cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to make, and more expensive to buy. And it's like, okay, fine, but listen, you wouldn't have been able to do this if it wasn't for humans.
Mhm.
you know and so you look, you just playing the odds. I used to be really right down the middle about this, or not right down the middle, or right down the edge, on the right side of this, of just, oh no, no, it's American ingenuity and blah blah blah, and that's a load of crap. They're not, companies today are not American ingenuity anymore. There's no such thing as buy American. I'm That's long gone. It's buy crap, whether it comes from China or it comes from America. Buy crap. That's all we're doing. We're just buying crap, and they're just making it as cheap as they possibly can. And how many iterations of phones have come out, and there's not a single thing different, in these phones. Everything's just these slight tweaks to just, it's like they're like selling drugs. And that's the world that we live in now, but it's not. But I wouldn't say everything goes. I would say that all that kind of nonsense, that's what's got us in this position.
Mhm.
I think more than anything else is businesses that just could care less about people. You just flat can't care anymore about people. And so they just want to sell stuff and make money. And now I've seen it because I've been around for a little while. I know what I'm talking about. It used to be that companies used to be in business to sell things. Well, now, I, I should clarify that, because even in my high school marketing class, they said the rule of marketing is every business is in business to make a profit. Okay, so yes, but the ways that businesses have gone, the extremes that businesses have gone to make profits now, to me personally, is like this. It's unrighteous. Now it's just wicked, just treating people like dirt.
Mm.
And people are just tired of it. And I think that's really what we're looking at is just people are just really tired. And so it's not a new normal. Um, it's a correction. The pendulum has been swinging this far for so long, and it's just gonna swing back. And but it's and a government that really doesn't have any authority over businesses. This is one of the problems with the whole idea of, oh, Democrats for the people, Democrats for the people. Well, but the Democrats don't do anything with business. And so it's like, now you've got this problem with businesses just running wild. They're running amok, doing whatever they want to do now. And I'm not saying the Republicans are any better, because Republicans are like, yeah, no, here, we'll give you perks and benefits and this is and that's and the other thing. You just keep America wonderful. But no, the whole thing's out of control. It's just out of control, and people are just tired of it. And
Yeah.
it's gone beyond politics now. It's like, seeing 2024, who am I going to vote for? If it was possible for me to vote for the nullification of the American government, I would vote for that. I would vote for that. Pure anarchy. I think anarchy at this point would do a better job. Sadly.
I think Jordan Peterson would agree with you.
Sadly, I think anarchy would
Yeah.
do a much better job at bringing correction that needs to be done, because everything just keeps swinging over to this way. So it's not. I don't want to call it a new normal. I'm not trying to be. I'm stopping the things in mid motion, but this whole idea of new normal, it gets said a lot. New normal, new normal. Yeah. This is a new normal. Well, that's what the movers and shakers want. They want this to be the new normal, because I can't think of a better way to run a company than in terms of, if I don't care about people or widgets, and I only care about money, and I don't care about anything else, cheaper the better. Less expensive and more of them. That's the deal. Less expensive to make, and sell more of them. And not have to do anything. If I could go down to one day every month coming into the office, to make sure that my company's still going, great. Yeah, fine. But the thing is that it's just all greed, and it's mammon is what it is. It's just driven by mammon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the thing that when I first moved here, I realized, that money is the god here. It's not. It's not a free for all. It's cash. So if you want to say something that's not cynical about where the world is in terms of the quote new normal, the new normal is cash. It's cash. It's about cash. It's just about having cash. That really is the big thing. And it's sad. It's sad to look at, and it's not God's normal, and it's just why. So we're actually going somewhere here, even though we're wandering through the forest here and looking at just about every flower that's nearby us. The idea really does kind of play together, because this is not how God wanted the world to be. What we're experiencing, this is not what God wanted. God did not want a bunch of corporate executives, milking every dime out of society, and every minute, out of society. That's not what God wanted, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I think about it, and there used to be a point to where I used to think, and this was me being a good Republican. I've been delivered. Just to say, I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I've been delivered from it altogether. The idea of companies should not cap how much money companies should make. And I disagree now. I disagree, because if a company could only make a certain amount of money, that would stop the nonsense of what it's doing to people, because they there'd be no point in cutting corners. Maybe not so much money, how much money they can make, but how much profit they can make. Their net profit, should be capped. Maybe, and this is socialism. I understand what I'm saying here. This is socialism, but these are the things. This is why socialism is attractive, is because of these little elements. If it wasn't the other elements that make socialism so horrible, if they could be in there, but if we could just find a happy medium somewhere in the middle here, and just, it's God's way. If you think about in the Bible, God's way, God's normal. What is God's normal and God's way? Is you do make money. You have land, you own land, you raise, animals or crops. I was trying to think of the word for it.
I was like children.
No, crops. So I mean, because I'm thinking vegetables, fruit. It's like it's much more larger than that. Grain, whatever. So you're raising crops, you're raising animals, whatever. I mean, and then you're selling these, in the open market, and there's natural competition because everybody's bringing so many. They only have a limited supply of these. But then you get into this corporation thing where you start gathering together all these little farmers into one big farmer, and then little farmers can't do anything anymore, and all that. But that was God's way of doing things. Was we raise our stuff, we trade with each other, we barter for things, and that's what God thinks is normal. It's funny because living in England, I learned a lot. I think England is probably closer to the way things should be than America. If you could, I'll tell you, if England had the weather of Hawaii, everybody'd want to live there. Everybody would want to live in England. Because you can put up with high taxes. You can put up with that kind of stuff because high taxes just means you don't have as much spending money. But it doesn't mean that they're taking everything away from you, or at least trying to, and push you out of the market,
Just waiting for my wife to send me a text about traveling right now.
But I mean, it's funny. It's funny. There's gives and takes of everything. A lot of this stuff I am saying kind of tongue in cheek, but the truth of the matter is that when we talk about normal. Hopefully we can see from this podcast, there really is no such thing as normal when it comes to, because I'm sure there are things that I've said that people, oh, no, most people don't agree with that, but that's just you multiplying yourself out, right. And saying there's a lot of people like me. Oh, really? Can you name me like 100? Just name me 100 people that are just like you. No, you can't. You could probably name 5 that are just like you, but you couldn't name 100. But yeah, that's normal. And so a lot of our conversation, even though we're kind of meandering, is just proof that there's no such thing as normal outside of God. Mm-hmm. You're not gonna find a normal, without God. And see that to me, that's the great thing about it is no matter what's happening in the world, no matter how jacked up the world is, I know God's in control.
So there's a question, and I'm going to save that for an off topic.
Okay.
You gave me a bunch of questions. As you're talking, I'm putting questions down. That's how all these podcasts go now. And now I don't have time to ask all of them. So we're just going to roll into the next segment anyway. Yeah. So go ahead and fill in your off-topic questions if you want. I'm going to keep talking, and we're going to keep having a conversation, and we'll just kind of we'll just take random shots whenever people have questions, and we'll just ask them. But okay, so you're talking about. You talked about normal from the standpoint of like going into a restaurant and scanning and kind of getting a feel for what the norm is the atmosphere, right?
Yes.
The environment.
Yeah.
And so,
well, it's something God's put in us. Not everybody can do it. But it is something that God put in us.
That's not for everybody. So
no, it's not that it's not for everybody.
No, what I mean is not everybody does that.
Some people don't have the capacity.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. They just don't have the capacity.
Yeah.
It's a different. There's pieces missing.
Yeah. So that actually reminded me of when you talked about first going in. For me, this wasn't the case because I was raised in the church atmosphere and around that. So to me, that growing up, that was normal. Church was normal, which is probably
Yes.
one of the things that shot me in the foot over the years.
Yeah.
But when you walked into a church, you looked around and went, these people are different. Something's different about these people.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's nothing normal.
And so it was nothing you could call normal
No.
there. And
No.
actually, the Bible a few times refers to God's people as peculiar,
Yeah.
which is another way to say not the same as everybody else,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so when you walked in, you thought, I could never be like these people.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But you eventually became just like those people.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I didn't think I could become like those people is because I didn't know what those people were. That was the problem. Is I had a false impression.
So it's back to your idea about lack of knowledge.
Again, yeah. And so it was a false impression because I thought these were people who somehow, I didn't know how, but my first shot at this was somehow escaped temptation. And they just never did anything wrong.
Mhm.
You know, they were very nice. They were very loving, very forgiving, of me. Here I am, this, dirty sinner walking into their clean environment. Thinking, if I were them, I wouldn't want me here, polluting their little domain. Because I didn't know anything about what church, I didn't even know that that's, what church was for. I didn't know churches were supposed to do that, bring people in and help them. I didn't know that. It was like, to me, this was just like a special club of people that I got an invitation to. So like I have been before, I've been invited to private club situations, and that's all it was. It was not, it wasn't, I was going to a private club and those people expected me to be a certain kind of person if I walked in those doors. Well, so for me, that was just pretty, I thought that was just the way it was, and so walking into church, that was kind of how it was. I was invited. I'd never been to one like that before. And to me, it was like that. It was like walking into a private club. But yeah, no, I felt completely out of place, and I didn't think I could be like them. Yeah, you're right. And so,
How long did it take?
How long did it take for me to become like them?
Yeah.
That day? So that was the thing that was interesting is that by the next morning, I could probably give you almost an exact time, probably by 3:00 the next day, because it was about that time when I had finally got through the fighting of telling people that what happened to me the night before when I became a Christian, and telling people I'm not going to be living this way anymore. And so out of that, once I overcame that, then I was able to, start talking to people about what had happened to me. And then I was one of them because I was talking just like they were talking to me.
Okay. So this is kind of, I was hoping to kind of drive home a certain point, but on the idea of people seeing that what we believe and what the Bible teaches is like really foreign. I've talked to people at work, I talk to people on the streets, and when we're outreaching and stuff like that, and we're talking to people, and there is an obvious disconnect in familiarity.
Yeah.
Right? And so what does it take for that gap to be bridged? How do people you came to church, there was an invitation for you, there was a bit of an experience, you felt like God told you needed to go. You just go with him.
Well, this is where the snag comes in, is that I was one of the people that I'm talking to at one point, and I became a Christian. And that's the problem, is there's a lot of people that are not Christians that have that have always been Christians. They've always been Christians. And because they've always been Christians, they don't know what it's like to not be a Christian. And those are the ones that have the difficult time being able to tell other people, because they don't know what it's like. And this is true even of Christians that, like your classic night clubbing type Christians, is that kind of idea that you have, people are, I was in the nightclub and I know what it's like and stuff like, but you were never in a nightclub not as a Christian. You were you always believed in God.
Mm-hmm.
These are people, they don't believe in God, and their motivation to do things is very, very different. They're not anything like the people that are in the clubs that are doing what they're doing, because they're not in there thinking it's okay to do this because, you know, or they are in there thinking it's okay to do this because there's no eternity, there's no God, there's no, not everybody's like that, of course, but there's a gap. You know, you maybe have a few people who have a Christian background, who enough of a Christian background to know that God's real and are just living in sin, but a far bigger majority. So the point that I'm making in all this is that you can't just think that you know what it's like. Just because you sinned doesn't mean you understand what it's like to be a non-Christian sinner. And so you have to talk to a lot of people. I mean, that's the only way to learn, is you have to talk to a lot of people, you know, a lot of people, and you need to listen a lot. Talk a little, listen a lot. Use my rule that I always use. Watch them as you're talking and pretend you're talking to somebody underwater. And then when you've been talking for more than 2 minutes and you start see them turn blue, you know, you realize they've got to come up for air. You know, so you should be trying to get them to talk more.
I'm going to start setting my timer in conversations. Okay. I think you might want to have our landlord call an exterminator. You see that giant rat that was walking through here a second ago? Like not sure. Maybe that was actually like a possum or something crawling in front of our screen here. I hope you guys didn't notice that. On the topic of being normal, you kind of already answered this question actually, but on the topic of being normal, my normal might be different than your normal. Who determines what is normal, and how do we get on the same page?
Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah.
That's my point, is there is no normal. You're not talking about normal.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you think something is normal and somebody else doesn't think it's normal, neither of you are talking about normal. You're talking about familiar. You're talking about something that you're used to, but you can't use the word normal. And that's my point in all of this, is the idea of just because we use the word normal about a thing, that doesn't make it normal. You can say, "Oh, it's just normal. It's just normal." No, that's, you think it's normal, but it isn't just normal, because you are not God and you do not decide what is normal and what isn't normal. And so just because something is normal for you doesn't mean it's normal. You know, and then this is part of the reason why the phrase ugly American exists, is because Americans go to other countries and they act normal. And that's the problem, is that in those countries, they're not acting normal. They're acting weird.
Mm-hmm.
But it's normal. No. You're the weird one. I'm normal. I'm American. I'm normal. Yep. And we'd like you to go home. You know, we hope you go home soon. You know, why do you think countries have, like, you know, visa requirements for Americans? Well, they need visa requirements because they don't want you to live there. They don't want you staying for a long period of time. You can stay for a little while, but then you go home. Go back to your normal. See, and that's the problem, is that we're like that. And it's not just Americans that are like that. Is, you know, people in general can be like that, you know, where we decide this is normal. You know, and it's not right. It's not right. It's funny. Some of the things. So in the Middle East, you know, they have all kinds of different cultural issues and stuff like that in the Middle East. And you hear people, oh, you know, wow, they this and that and the other thing, you know, and it's a horrible thing what they're doing to people, oppressing people and stuff like that. And it's like, well, says who? You know, I mean, you say that because you live here. But do they say that? You know, if they say it, okay, it's another story if they say it, you know, but if they're not saying it, it's not abnormal, you know, if it's the way that they live, you know. Spain shuts down for 2 hours, you know, for siesta. And during the siesta for 2 hours, there's no business. You can't do any business. And so it's like, you know, is that wrong? You know, because they've shut down 2 hours in the middle of the day and you need something, you know, and you're gonna go over there, Mr. Mouthy from another country. You know, in our country, we don't do that stupid thing because we're not lazy. And it's like, who says that's lazy? You know? And so, I mean, and you can just go on with this. But, normal isn't what we think, okay? I have a normal, you have a normal. No, we don't. Neither of us has a normal. I have what I do, you have what you do, but neither of us is a normal. Maybe normal for you, and that's fine, but it's just your normal, and there's no. That's why the phrase, that statement, it's kind of funny because it's like, how do we meet in the middle? Well, if you meet in the middle by first stop talking about normal, you know, stop thinking that your way is normal and you're trying to bring them over to your way, or you're trying to find some halfway between here. You don't need to. It's not necessary. Find a way to communicate. Find a way to agree, by not being normal. Give up your normal so that you can communicate with people. Again, becoming all things to all men, Paul said, but that by all means I might save some. When you're worried about trying to make the universe your kind of normal, you're not gonna do that.
So this is the off-topic question related to a previous question that was asked. Considering the direction of society, is it sensible to think COVID needed to happen?
No. COVID was just completely out of left field. My opinion. This is my opinion. But my opinion is the normal one. Just kidding, in case nobody got that. No, because nobody was ready for it. I mean, how could you be ready for something like that? It was just crazy. It was amazingly.
Thanks, Clarissa. I'm glad you got it.
Amazingly left field. I mean, it really was. I mean, it changed our world. I mean, it literally changed our world. But my opinion, COVID was, and politics have been saying this for a while. It came out with that whole statement by Rahm Emanuel. Never let a good crisis go to waste. That was a moment of a politician showing his cards. Because that's how all politicians think.
Yeah.
It's like there's okay. There's probably some exceptions. Okay, but
very few.
Politics in general, that is what it is. It is managing society and in chaos or crisis is always a good opportunity to change public policy. Into something that you want it to be. And that's the problem is that for what I learned in school, which probably is obsolete now, that the whole idea of the government was for the people, not for the government, to be able to impose on the people. But those days are long gone. And now it's just imposition. It doesn't matter what government it is. It's just imposing itself on people to keep people under control.
Mm.
And if it understandably so, because there are kind of some weird people out there, and so but you have to keep control. But I think it's funny. I mean, our whole world's like that. Corporate's like that as well. I mean, it's all bad. I don't want anybody thinking that I'm leaning on any direction. Have you ever looked at your last terms and conditions? You can't even read them anymore. They're so big. That's why they don't even have to print them anymore. They make a PDF that's like 500K.
Yeah.
And it's like nobody's going to read that. But basically, it doesn't matter if you read it, because basically what it says is you have no rights and we have all rights. And so as long as you're okay with that, just click okay and let's move on.
Yeah.
Okay. And so whatever you think, it doesn't matter. Whatever we think, that's all that matters. And that's it. It's just the world we live in now. But no, I wouldn't say that COVID had to happen. I would say that probably bad timing. I would probably go as far as to say it's probably one of the worst things that could probably have happened.
Yeah.
In terms of the sharks, and I will just be global with that term. In terms of the sharks, people in this universe, people on this planet that are looking to take advantage of other people. Here we go. Here's our great chance to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Okay. All the questions. A fun ending. You guys got no more? I think we just kind of like deflated all the questions with the idea of living outside me.
Well, that's a yeah, it's a hard way to live, because we rely so much on the fact that we exist. This is the whole I think therefore I am, back in the 80s, as that was the well, actually even before the 80s, but that's everything, is that I'm autonomous, and it's funny because when you read history, it wasn't always like that. You read like if you when you read in the 50s about the 50s, okay, if you go back to the like 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the world wasn't like it is today. Nothing. It was nothing like it is today, and that wasn't that long ago. Um, but China wasn't China, Russia wasn't Russia. Like it is today. I mean, it wasn't like that. Germany wasn't Germany. You know, it was just a very different world. It was just a very very different world. And but back in the day of the barbarians and the Huns and the what's the starts with a V. The Anyway, I can't remember. But anyway, these marauders, oh, I'm glad those days are over. I'm not. I'd be quite happy to see those days come back again because I'd like to see governments topple, and something else be put in their place, because things have just gotten out of hand. I mean, they're just really, everything's keeps, and that's the problem, is that everything just keeps leaning in the same direction until it falls over. And so, it's tragic, but it's all because of, it's us, we us, wanting to do things. It's funny because we read stories like about Alexander the Great and stuff like that. We don't read about all the nations that he conquered as a bad thing. We talk about it as progress, as moving forward, and Alexander the Great, is a model, leadership models, and
Yeah.
things like that. It's like these, so people who used to kill people by the thousands,
Yeah.
they're not listening to me. Kill them all.
Yes. Yeah.
But
that's a very interesting perspective.
He's a great leader in his own way.
Yes, we should learn lessons from him.
Caesar.
Yep.
All these kinds of things, and then we look at our world today and think, we could. I wouldn't want a Caesar to rise up from within our ranks, but I wouldn't mind a Caesar coming from another country coming over here and hacking away at us. Because it could only be better. It couldn't get any worse. It could only be better.
All right. Well, homework for everybody: go read 1984 and Animal Farm. Put those things into practice.
1984 and Brave New World are interesting.
Okay. Those that was a joke. He's serious. This is homework. You should go read.
But those are interesting books because they're two different approaches to the same problem, and it's very interesting because it's the world is going to get towards this tyrannical dictator, big brother, or it's going to go into where everybody can do whatever they want. And it's two polar opposites, but both of them are bad. The end results of both books is bad, because we don't want either of those things. We don't want to be able to do whatever we want to do, and we don't want to be controlled down to the nth degree.
Mm-hmm.
So
what is the alternative to those?
Balance.
But where does balance come from?
Balance in the middle. Well, somebody somewhere, like I look at this and I think, I think it's time, for I think the public in general have already kind of made up their mind. They're just not going to work for the companies anymore that are not going to give them what they want. And so in some ways it's corrective, and that, people would say, well, see, that's the system. That's That's capitalism at work. But yet it's way down the road, though. I mean, we're way down the road. There's something that should have been able to happen a long time earlier, but didn't, because people didn't, they needed, now, because that's the question, isn't it? People always ask, so where is, how are these people getting money? If they're not working, how are they getting money? And that's the big question, how are they getting money? Well, I think if enough people don't have any money, then, well, maybe then things will get cheaper. Which, would that be a bad thing if that happened? I don't have any answers for any of this. It's far beyond my pay grade. But balance, I mean, it's got to be in the middle, for goodness sake. Look again, the Bible. Look at the Bible. Look at what the Bible says. Look at the Word of God says. The Bible. It's if people were Christians, we wouldn't have any of this.
Yeah.
I mean, let's think about this.
I mean, doesn't being a Christian kind of transcend the whole thing?
If I was a CEO of a company and I was a Christian, I wouldn't be looking at who I can lay off.
No, you'd be staying closed on Sunday.
Well, I probably would be staying closed on Sunday, but I would also be looking for, how do we make this thing work, so we can be a successful company, but at the same time, the people who work for us like working for us. Mm-hmm. I mean, that to me, that just doesn't, it defies imagination for me to think that CEOs of companies don't think of this. It's just not on their radar.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's not on their radar at all.
Yeah.
But they always start like that. That's probably the greatest job ever, is work for a startup until they're not a startup anymore, yes. And then go to another startup.
Yeah.
Because startups are like, they're all friendly and they want to help and they want to get things going and they want everybody on and until they hit, that moment, that momentum moment. And it's like, okay, you, we love you. We're glad that you guys worked for us, but, out, because you cost too much money. We're going to start chopping at the top, and to make it look fair, we'll chop at the bottom as well. Yep. And then we'll just keep raking in the cash, and it's sad. I know who the true evil person is, but probably not worth. I'll throw it out there because we're almost done with our podcast. It's the corporate executives. It's the board of directors. They're the evil people behind all this.
And they're the most disconnected.
I've watched it. I've watched it at a personal level. I've worked for enough companies. I've watched it at a personal level. It's the board of directors. They want to squeeze blood out of a turnip. It's like, what do you mean we didn't get 14% this year? We've gotten 14% profit over the last 30 years. If we could get 14% profit over the last 30 years, why can't we get another 14 this year? Well, think about that. 14 of 14 of 14 of 14 of 14. You're talking about making like X 1,000% profit, over 30 years. Mm-hmm. It's like, come on, it's like, listen, how about if we miss a year every now and then? Oh yeah, but I'm only going to have $250 million next year. I was hoping to have 3. It's like, at some point, people. But anyway, and the people who own stock vote for these people.
Yeah.
Well, who do they want in there? They want the greedy people in there, the ones who are going to turn the screws on the company. Yeah. So it's like the whole system is just jacked. Anyway, I'm done. Let me get my soapbox out.
How about you put it away?
No, actually, as long as we're talking about this, what I'm really, really, really hoping is, we're
so off topic.
Is that all of a sudden, God says, I'm going to impose normal. I'm going to bring the world back to normal. And he is going to. That's what's going to happen, is he's going to bring the world back to normal. That's the thing, is when it's all said and done, that's exactly where we're going to be, is it's going to come back to normal. We're going to come back to one of my favorite words. homeostasis. We're going to come back to equilibrium where things are where they're supposed to be. And I'm looking forward to that. I really am. So go ahead and sign us off.
Okay. Well, that was a fun night. I like the direction that went, actually. Tonight same time next week. We'll be here again. New topic, new day, and we'll see how society has shifted since today.
Since today.
1 week seems to make a big difference these days. Lots happening in the world. So gives me lots of fodder for topics. Anyway, we encourage everybody. I appreciate the questions, the comments. That was fun. I love when these are engaging. It makes conversations very fun, very organic. I used to put down like 10 questions, and now I only put down 3 or 4, and they seem to flow pretty naturally anyway. But join us this week. We have service tomorrow, midweek service. We invite you to join us in person, and we'll be here early, but the service starts at 7:00. Information about our service times will be on your screen in a second. However, what won't be on your screen is we are having a special Easter event Sunday night. So Sunday morning we will have our annual Easter service. In the morning we'll be doing communion. We'll be a special service that morning, and then Sunday night, our regular service time, we'll be having a special Easter production. So I encourage you to invite people. If you're in the local area, come be a part of it. It's going to be fun. Definitely going to be different than a typical like play style, but encourage you to come, and you can find more information about us and other things online on our YouTube page and on our website. But more than anything else, we want to see you. We want to meet you in person. Come and let God work in your life, and join us again next week. We'll see everybody soon.